In November 1812, the temperature plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius as Napoleon's Grande Armée approached the Berezina River. Thousands of French soldiers huddled together, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. When dawn broke, over 50,000 men lay frozen in grotesque positions, some still standing, propped up by their rifles. This wasn't the result of Russian artillery or cavalry charges. Their killer was nature itself. As one survivor wrote, "Death no longer held any terror. The cold had conquered our fear of dying." But this wasn't the first time Mother Nature had decided the fate of armies. Throughout history, the elements have proven more lethal than any human weapon. From typhoons that swallowed entire fleets to sandstorms that buried armies alive, nature has shaped warfare in ways generals never expected. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow marked the beginning of modern warfare's most brutal lesson: never underestimate winter. His Grande Armée, originally 422,000 strong, began disintegrating long before facing significant Russian resistance. The killing started with nighttime temperatures dropping below freezing in October. Soldiers' fingers turned black with frostbite. Horses, unable to find forage under the snow, died by the thousands. Without horses, artillery had to be abandoned. Without artillery, the army became vulnerable. The devastation was methodical. First came the cold's attack on the body. Frostbite claiming fingers and toes, hypothermia slowing minds and reactions. Then came the psychological torture. Men would hallucinate from the cold, stripping naked in the snow, convinced they were burning up. A phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. Soldiers reported watching their comrades wandering off into snowstorms, never to be seen again. Supply lines collapsed entirely. The frozen ground was too hard to dig for roots. Horses that died were stripped to the bone within hours by starving men. Soldiers fought over scraps of leather to eat, boiled their own belts for soup. The lucky ones found frozen potatoes in abandoned villages. The unlucky resorted to cannibalism. Yet Napoleon wasn't the first to learn this harsh lesson. In 1708, Charles Exile of Sweden marched his army into Russia during what historians would later call the Little Ice Age. That winter was the coldest Europe had seen in 500 years. Swedish soldiers discovered a terrifying truth: their muskets wouldn't fire in extreme cold. The gunpowder wouldn't ignite. Metal triggers snapped like twigs. When temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, men froze to death while standing guard. The Swedish army's destruction was complete. Of 40,000 men who entered Russia, only 3,000 survived. The cold attacked in waves, first killing the weakest, then the horses, finally even the hardiest veterans succumbed. Military historians would later note that more Swedish soldiers died from cold-related gangrene than from Russian bullets. But perhaps the most devastating example came during World War II's Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's generals studied Napoleon's campaign extensively, believing they could avoid his mistakes. They were wrong. The German army wasn't prepared for the Russian autumn mud that bogged down their vehicles, let alone the winter that followed. Tanks wouldn't start. Oil froze in engines. Soldiers discovered their winter clothing was still in warehouses in Germany, deemed not yet necessary. The cold did what the Red Army initially couldn't. It stopped the German advance dead in its tracks. Outside Moscow, German soldiers reported their breath freezing into crystals that tinkled like breaking glass when they exhaled. Thousands suffered frozen machines, their blood literally crystallizing in their veins. German field hospitals filled with cold casualties. Doctors amputated frostbitten limbs by the hundreds. The lucky ones lost fingers and toes. The unlucky developed trench foot, their flesh literally rotting while still attached to their bodies. Soldiers' diaries spoke of men crying in agony as their frozen feet shattered like glass inside their boots. Modern analysis has revealed just how unprepared these armies were for winter warfare. The German Wehrmacht vehicles used rubber components that became brittle in extreme cold. Their engines required special winterization they never received. Even their weapons failed. Machine guns would jam as lubricating oil thickened in the cold. The same weapons that had conquered France now became useless chunks of metal. But it wasn't just the mechanical failures that doomed these armies. The cold attacked human psychology in ways military planners never anticipated. Soldiers developed winter fatigue, a combination of exhaustion and hypothermia that made simple tasks impossible. Men would forget basic training, unable to remember how to load their weapons or read maps. Some would simply sit down in the snow and refuse to move, knowing it meant certain death, but unable to motivate themselves to continue. The Soviets, meanwhile, had developed winter warfare into an art form. Their tanks used special low-temperature oil that wouldn't freeze. Soldiers wore quilted uniforms with fur-lined boots. Most importantly, they understood the psychological warfare that winter waged. Soviet troops would often attack at night, when temperatures were lowest, knowing the cold had already broken their enemy's will to fight. The military archives tell an even grimmer story about the toll of winter warfare. In the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, more soldiers died from hypothermia than from Soviet bullets. Medical records show that for every combat casualty, 4 men were lost to the cold. The pattern repeated in field hospitals across the Eastern Front, frostbite causing more amputations than enemy fire. Even modern armies aren't immune to winter's wrath. During the Korean War, American troops learned the same brutal lessons at the Chosin Reservoir. Marines nicknamed it Frozen Chosin, as temperatures dropped to -35 degrees Celsius. Their equipment froze, morphine syrettes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before they could be used on the wounded. The cold claimed fingers, toes, and lives with mechanical efficiency. The pattern was undeniable. 3 of history's most powerful armies, French, Swedish, and German, had marched into Russia believing they could overcome anything. Each was defeated not by bullets or bayonets, but by winter itself. Nature had proven more lethal than any human weapon, more efficient than any military strategy. The cold had written its own chapters in military history, using frozen blood and broken armies as its ink. But while freezing temperatures claimed armies on land, another force of nature was brewing over the seas, one that would swallow entire invasion fleets whole and change the course of nations. The ocean itself was about to demonstrate its terrifying power. The year was 1274. Kublai Khan's massive Mongol invasion fleet approached Japan's shores. With over 900 ships and 40,000 men, victory seemed certain. But as the fleet neared Hakata Bay, the sky turned an ominous green. Local fishermen recognized the signs. A typhoon was coming. Within hours, a storm of biblical proportions struck the Mongol fleet. Massive waves capsized ships packed with warriors. Winds powerful enough to snap masts drove vessels into each other or dashed them against the rocky coast. By morning, a third of the Mongol fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. Over 13,000 men drowned. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. But nature wasn't finished. 7 years later, when Kublai Khan launched an even larger invasion with 140,000 men and 4,400 ships, another typhoon struck in the exact same place. This time, nearly the entire fleet was destroyed. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered vast territories from China to Eastern Europe, was stopped not by samurai swords but by wind and waves. The power of storms to change military history wasn't limited to ancient times. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, deemed invincible, met its match in the stormy North Atlantic. After failed engagements with English ships, the Armada attempted to retreat around Scotland and Ireland. What followed was a masterclass in nature's fury. Hurricane-force winds drove ships onto treacherous reefs. Massive waves broke wooden hulls like twigs. Of 130 ships, only 67 returned to Spain. Over 20,000 sailors perished, most not from combat, but from drowning or exposure. Even in the modern era, weather continues to dictate military operations. During the D-Day invasion of 1944, General Eisenhower faced an agonizing decision. A massive storm system threatened to derail the largest amphibious invasion in history. The operation required specific conditions: a full moon for light, low tide to expose German obstacles, and clear weather for air support. The original date of June 5th was impossible due to high winds and heavy seas. Weather forecasters identified a narrow 36-hour window where conditions would briefly improve. Eisenhower made the call to launch on June 6. The decision proved crucial. The storm had forced German forces to lower their guard, believing no invasion was possible in such weather. Had Eisenhower waited for the next suitable date 2 weeks later, another storm system would have destroyed the invasion fleet. The aftermath of D-Day demonstrated weather's continued influence. The same storm that almost prevented the invasion returned with a vengeance on June 19th, becoming one of the worst summer storms in Channel history. The artificial mulberry harbors, crucial for supplying the beachhead, were severely damaged. Had this storm struck during the invasion, D-Day would have ended in catastrophe. But perhaps the most dramatic example of weather's impact on modern warfare came during the Vietnam War's Operation Linebacker U. In December 1972, the US launched a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Strategic planners had accounted for enemy defenses, anti-aircraft fire, and MiG interceptors. What they hadn't counted on was the monsoon season. The lessons of weather warfare extended far beyond the monsoon seasons. In the Falklands War of 1982, the British Royal Navy faced some of the most treacherous sailing conditions on Earth. The South Atlantic's notorious storms created waves that towered over 50 feet high. Helicopter pilots described trying to land on pitch and carrier decks as like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. The Argentine Air Force, meanwhile, found their attack run severely limited by the brutal weather conditions. Nature's impact on air warfare proved particularly devastating during Operation Eagle Claw, the failed 1980 attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. The mission planners had anticipated every human obstacle, but they hadn't counted on haboobs, the massive dust storms that sweep across the Iranian desert. These storms, with winds reaching 70 miles per hour and visibility dropping to mere feet, forced helicopters to abort their mission. The resulting chain of events led to a catastrophic failure that cost 8 American servicemen their lives. The Gulf War introduced the world to a new weather phenomenon that could paralyze modern armies: Sharma winds. These desert storms could arise suddenly, carrying so much sand that they would clog air filters, seize engines, and ground aircraft. During Operation Desert Storm, entire tank columns had to halt when their sophisticated targeting systems were rendered useless by walls of flying sand. The same technology that made American forces seemingly invincible proved worthless against nature's fury. Military historians note a tragic irony. As warfare became more technologically advanced, armies became more vulnerable to weather, not less. Modern weapons systems require precise conditions to operate effectively. A medieval army could fight in almost any weather. A modern army, dependent on electronics, satellites, and precision munitions, can be rendered ineffective by conditions that would barely have slowed their ancestors. The US military learned this lesson again in Somalia in 1993. During the infamous Black Hawk Down incident, sudden sandstorms reduced visibility to near zero, complicating already challenging rescue operations. The same sand that blinded pilots also worked its way into helicopter engines and weapons, causing crucial equipment failures at the worst possible moments. But while storms and weather could sink ships and ground aircraft, another element was about to demonstrate its power to swallow armies whole. The earth itself would open up, turning solid ground into drowning pools that would claim more lives than any human weapon. In 492 BCE, the Persian commander Mardonius led the largest fleet ever assembled, over 300 ships carrying 20,000 men, toward Greece. As they rounded Mount Athos, local guides warned him about the peninsula's treacherous waters. Mardonius ignored them. Within hours, a sudden storm transformed the calm sea into a marine graveyard. Massive waves threw ships against coastal cliffs. Others simply vanished into the depths. 300 ships and 20,000 men, gone in a single day. But drowning armies wasn't just nature's work at sea. The land itself could become a liquid death trap. During World War I's Battle of Passchendaele, Allied forces learned this in the most horrific way possible. The heaviest rainfall in 30 years had turned the Belgian lowlands into a quagmire. The artillery barrage that preceded the attack had destroyed the region's drainage systems, creating a landscape of liquid mud. Soldiers described the ground as porridge. Men who stepped off duckboards would sink to their waists in seconds. The mud wasn't just an obstacle, it was a predator. Wounded soldiers who fell would slowly sink and drown, while their comrades watched helplessly. Artillery pieces disappeared overnight, swallowed by the earth. Horses panicked as the ground beneath them literally dissolved. The Hell of Passchendaele claimed 275,000 British casualties alone. Soldiers' diaries speak of men drowning in shell holes, their equipment dragging them down into the mud. Others described watching helplessly as stretcher bearers, carrying wounded, would slip into water-filled craters and vanish. The mud consumed everything: men, machines, hope itself. This wasn't the first time armies had underestimated flooding's lethal power. In 1421, the Chinese Ming dynasty sent an army of 100,000 men to capture a rebel stronghold on Lake Poem. The rebel leader Chen Zhui waited for the seasonal floods, then breached the dikes protecting the main army's camp. The resulting deluge didn't just drown thousands. It created whirlpools that sucked men and horses under. Survivors described watching entire cavalry units disappear into the churning waters. Modern armies proved equally vulnerable to nature's fluid warfare. During the Korean War, the American 2nd Infantry Division faced an enemy more lethal than North Korean troops, spring thaws. As mountain snow melted, valleys turned into raging torrents. Supply trucks were swept away. Ammunition dumps disappeared under rising waters. The flooding didn't just halt military operations, it turned the battlefield into a drowning hazard. But perhaps the most insidious threat came from quicksand and mudflats. During the Vietnam War, American forces discovered that the Mekong Delta's seemingly solid ground could become liquid death in seconds. Heavily equipped soldiers would sink into hidden mud pockets, their gear dragging them down. The more they struggled, the faster they sank. Special extraction teams had to be created just to rescue soldiers trapped in the Delta's hungry earth. The Iranian marshlands during the Iran-Iraq War proved equally treacherous. Iraqi forces attempting to cross what looked like solid ground found their tanks and armored vehicles sinking into the muck. The marshes didn't just swallow equipment, they created a unique form of psychological warfare. Soldiers developed marsh fear, terrified of taking each step, never knowing if the ground would remain solid. In Afghanistan, NATO forces faced an unexpected drowning hazard: Carrier's systems. These ancient underground water channels could collapse under the weight of vehicles, creating sudden sinkholes that would swallow entire trucks. The water-filled tunnels became death traps, claiming lives not through combat, but through nature's patient ambush. The power of water to destroy armies was limited to ancient times. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, American military planners faced an unexpected threat: the Euphrates River's spring floods. In 2003, entire supply routes disappeared under suddenly rising waters. Bradley fighting vehicles, designed to withstand enemy fire, proved helpless against swift currents that could sweep them off bridges. The Earth's ability to transform from solid to liquid claimed victims in every war. During the Second World War's Burma campaign, Japanese forces learned this lesson in the most brutal way. The monsoon seasons turned jumbled trails into rivers of mud. Entire divisions disappeared into the earth, their equipment and supplies swallowed by the voracious ground. Soldiers developed a saying: "The mud doesn't care what flag you fight under." Modern technology offered little protection against nature's fluid warfare. In 1991, during Desert Storm, American forces discovered that even desert sand could become a drowning hazard. The weight of tanks and armored vehicles would break through the desert's crusty surface, sinking them into fine sand that behaved like liquid. Recovery vehicles sent to help would often suffer the same fate. The phenomenon wasn't limited to deserts. In Bosnia, UN peacekeeping forces faced what they called living mud. Ground that appeared solid but could liquefy under pressure. Armored personnel carriers would sink up to their turrets in seconds. The mud didn't just trap vehicles, it created a tactical nightmare. Units had to abandon standard military doctrine, unable to maneuver on ground that could turn to liquid at any moment. Even the Arctic proved treacherous. During cold weather training in Norway, NATO forces discovered that frozen lakes could become deadly traps. The weight of military vehicles would crack the ice, creating what rescue teams called wet graves, holes that would instantly freeze over after swallowing their victims, trapping them under a ceiling of ice. But while water could drown armies, another element was preparing to demonstrate its lethal power. The sun itself would become a weapon, turning battlefields into ovens that would cook men alive in their own armor. The Parthian sun beat down mercilessly on the Roman legions at Carrhae in 53 BCE. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest generals, had marched 40,000 men deep into the desert. His soldiers carried 50 pounds of gear each through terrain where temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. When the Parthians finally attacked, the Romans discovered a horrifying truth. They were already defeated, not by arrows or swords, but by heat exhaustion. The desert had systematically destroyed the Roman army before combat even began. Men collapsed from heat stroke, their brains literally cooking inside their helmets. Their heavy armor, designed for European battlefields, turned into personal ovens. Water supplies, calculated for temperate conditions, ran out within days. When Parthian arrows finally rained down, they found an army already delirious from dehydration. Of the 40,000 Romans who marched into Parthia, only 10,000 survived. Most died not from combat, but from heat-related causes. Survivors ascribed hallucinations, men drinking sand convinced it was water. Others simply walked off into the desert, their minds broken by the relentless sun. 2,000 years later, the North African desert would claim new victims. During World War II's Desert War, both Axis and Allied forces discovered that the sun was a more lethal enemy than any human adversary. Tank crews suffered especially. Interior temperatures in tanks could reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Men would emerge from their steel vehicles with severe burns from touching metal surfaces inside. The desert's psychological warfare proved equally devastating. German soldiers reported sun madness, periods of mass hallucination where entire units would see phantom oases. British troops developed sand blindness, their eyes burned by constant exposure to sun-reflected glare. Medical units treated more cases of heat exhaustion than combat wounds. But it wasn't just the heat, the desert itself became a weapon. Sand worked its way into every piece of equipment. Engines failed as air filters clogged. Guns jammed as lubricating oil turned to abrasive paste. Radio equipment overheated and failed. The sophisticated machinery of modern warfare proved useless against the desert's primitive assault. Modern armies fared no better. During Desert Storm, American forces faced what meteorologists call the thermal low, a weather phenomenon that pushed temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers in chemical protection suits, necessary due to the threat of Iraqi chemical weapons, suffered in what amounted to personal saunas. Medical evacuations for heat casualties exceeded combat injuries during the war's opening days. The heat's impact on military equipment proved equally devastating. Helicopter engines would overheat and fail. Ammunition cooked off spontaneously in storage. Even the sophisticated electronics of modern warfare had their limits. Computers would shut down, their cooling systems overwhelmed by the ambient temperature. But perhaps the most insidious effect came from dehydration. A soldier in full combat gear could lose 2 liters of water per hour just from sweating. In high temperatures, the body's cooling mechanism becomes its greatest vulnerability. Men would die not from enemy fire, but from their own bodies cooking from the inside out. Afghanistan brought new lessons in heat warfare. In the Helmand province, summer ground temperatures could reach 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers carrying 100 pounds of gear would require over 3 gallons of water per day just to survive. Units learned to conduct operations at night, but the enemy, well adapted to the environment, held the advantage during daylight hours. In Iraq, coalition forces faced what local troops called the oven effect. Urban warfare in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees created unique challenges. The concrete and steel of cities absorbed heat during the day, turning streets into thermal canyons. Body armor designed to stop bullets became an instrument of heat torture. Soldiers had to choose between protection from enemy fire or protection from heat stroke. The Israeli Defense Forces learned similar lessons during desert operations. Their studies showed that the soldiers' combat effectiveness dropped by 50% after just 2 hours of exposure to extreme heat. Even more alarming, decision-making ability deteriorated rapidly. Unit commanders would make increasingly poor tactical choices as their core body temperature rose, putting entire operations at risk. But while water could drown armies, another element was preparing to demonstrate its lethal power. The sun itself would become a weapon, turning battlefields into ovens that would cook men alive in their own armor. The Parthian sun beat down mercilessly on the Roman legions at Cairo in 53 BCE. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest generals, had marched 40,000 men deep into the desert. His soldiers carried 50 pounds of gear each through terrain where temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. When the Parthians finally attacked, the Romans discovered a horrifying truth. They were already defeated, not by arrows or swords, but by heat exhaustion. The desert had systematically destroyed the Roman army before combat even began. Men collapsed from heat stroke, their brains literally cooking inside their helmets. Their heavy armor, designed for European battlefields, turned into personal ovens. Water supplies, calculated for temperate conditions, ran out within days. When Parthian arrows finally rained down, they found an army already delirious from dehydration. Of the 40,000 Romans who marched into Parthia, only 10,000 survived. Most died not from combat, but from heat-related causes. Survivors described hallucinations, men drinking sand convinced it was water. Others simply walked off into the desert, their minds broken by the relentless sun. 2,000 years later, the North African desert would claim new victims. During World War II's Desert War, both Axis and Allied forces discovered that the sun was a more lethal enemy than any human adversary. Tank crews suffered especially. Interior temperatures in tanks could reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Men would emerge from their steel vehicles with severe burns from touching metal surfaces inside. The desert's psychological warfare proved equally devastating. German soldiers reported sun madness, periods of mass hallucination where entire units would see phantom oases. British troops developed sun blindness, their eyes burned by constant exposure to sun-reflected glare. Medical units treated more cases of heat exhaustion than combat wounds. But it wasn't just the heat, the desert itself became a weapon. Sand worked its way into every piece of equipment. Engines failed as air filters clogged. Guns jammed as lubricating oil turned to abrasive paste. Radio equipment overheated and failed. The sophisticated machinery of modern warfare proved useless against the desert's primitive assault. Modern armies fared no better. During Desert Storm, American forces faced what meteorologists called a thermal low, a weather phenomenon that pushed temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers in chemical protection suits, necessary due to the threat of Iraqi chemical weapons, suffered in what amounted to personal solace. Medical evacuations for heat casualties exceeded combat injuries during the war's opening days. The heat's impact on military equipment proved equally devastating. Helicopter engines would overheat and fail. Ammunition cooked off spontaneously in storage. Even the sophisticated electronics of modern warfare had their limits. Computers would shut down, their cooling systems overwhelmed by the ambient temperature. But perhaps the most insidious effect came from dehydration. A soldier in full combat gear could lose 2 liters of water per hour just from sweating. In high temperatures, the body's cooling mechanism becomes its greatest vulnerability. Men would die not from enemy fire, but from their own bodies cooking from the inside out. Afghanistan brought new lessons in heat warfare. In the Helmand province, summer ground temperatures could reach 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers carrying 100 pounds of gear would require over 3 gallons of water per day just to survive. Units learned to conduct operations at night, but the enemy, well adapted to the environment, held the advantage during daylight hours. In Iraq, coalition forces faced what local troops called the oven effect. Urban warfare in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees created unique challenges. The concrete and steel of cities absorbed heat during the day, turning streets into thermal canyons. Body armor designed to stop bullets became an instrument of heat torture. Soldiers had to choose between protection from enemy fire or protection from heat stroke. The Israeli Defense Forces learned similar lessons during desert operations. Their studies showed that a soldier's combat effectiveness dropped by 50% after just 2 hours of exposure to extreme heat. Even more alarming, decision-making ability deteriorated rapidly. Unit commanders would make increasingly poor tactical choices as their core body temperature rose, putting entire operations at risk. The heat didn't just affect humans. Military working dogs, crucial for detecting explosives and enemy combatants, could only work for 15-minute intervals before requiring long cooling periods. Vehicles required special modifications, extra cooling systems that themselves would often fail in extreme temperatures. Even the most advanced military technology proved vulnerable to nature's simplest weapon, hot air. During the Iran-Iraq War, both sides witnessed the desert's ultimate display of power. Heat-induced dust devils that could reach heights of 1,000 feet. These thermal whirlwinds would appear suddenly, disrupting operations and destroying equipment. Helicopter pilots reported being thrown off course by these violent columns of superheated air. Russian forces in Syria discovered that extreme heat warfare had evolved. Modern thermal imaging equipment, crucial for tactical advantage, would malfunction as ambient temperatures approached the heat signatures they were designed to detect. The very technology meant to give them an edge became useless against nature's thermal assault. But while heat could cook armies alive, it would combine with another force of nature to create perhaps the most terrifying battlefield condition of all, when the very air itself became both fuel and weapon. Operation Desert Storm introduced the world to smart bombs and precision-guided missiles. What the world didn't see was how nature turned these technological marvels into useless hunks of metal. When Shamel winds hit coalition forces in 1991, visibility dropped to mere feet. Laser-guided weapons couldn't lock onto targets. GPS systems faltered. The most sophisticated military in history found itself grounded by blowing sand. Today's military planners face challenges their predecessors never imagined. Climate change has turned weather into an increasingly unpredictable enemy. In Afghanistan, American forces discovered that sudden temperature shifts could change battlefield conditions in hours. A passable mountain road could become a deadly avalanche zone. A dry riverbed could transform into a raging torrent. Even space-age technology proves vulnerable to nature's arsenal. During Operation Enduring Freedom, satellite-guided systems failed when solar storms disrupted GPS signals. Drone operations, crucial for modern warfare, become impossible during severe weather. The same electromagnetic interference that disrupts civilian cell phones can render million-dollar military communication systems useless. The US Navy's latest challenge comes from an unexpected source: climate change-induced extreme weather. Aircraft carriers, the backbone of naval power projection, face increasingly violent storms. In the Pacific, super typhoons can generate waves over 100 feet high. These megastorms force entire carrier groups to alter course, disrupting military operations across vast regions. Modern armies now employ dedicated meteorological units, treating weather as a critical intelligence factor. But even the most sophisticated weather prediction systems can't always anticipate nature's fury. In 2011, a freak sandstorm in Iraq disabled an entire mechanized battalion. The sand didn't just stop vehicles, it fused with hot engine parts, literally glassing them into useless sculptures. Special operations face unique challenges. High-altitude warfare in places like Nepal and Tibet isn't just about fighting enemy forces. It's about surviving air so thin it can kill. Holo jumps become impossible during unexpected wind shears. Even the most elite soldiers find themselves at nature's mercy. Looking ahead, military strategists worry about new environmental threats. Rising sea levels threaten coastal bases. Changing weather patterns disrupt traditional training cycles. Some war games now include scenarios where climate refugees outnumber enemy combatants. The irony isn't lost on military historians. As warfare becomes more technologically advanced, armies become increasingly vulnerable to nature's basic elements. A medieval army could fight in almost any weather. A modern army, dependent on electronics and precision weapons, can be rendered combat ineffective by a simple thunderstorm. Perhaps nature's greatest lesson to military planners is one of humility. The same military forces that can level cities and reshape continents remain powerless against a simple shift in the wind. Mother Nature remains undefeated, the one adversary no army has ever conquered. If you love military history like I do, subscribe for more content like this.